Well, hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Whale Sanctuary Project's first webinar for 2022 on beluga whales. Who are beluga whales? And we have three incredible guests today. And I just wanted to start the webinar by just taking a moment to say that our thoughts are with the Ukrainian people today and Ukraine as a country, and that you are in our thoughts and in our very best wishes. So as we start, I'd like to share my screen for one moment to show you something. And then I'm going to introduce my guests. That is a beluga whale brain. And that is the brain of a beluga whale who we studied a few years ago, who died of natural causes. And that's the postmortem brain. We did an imaging study of that brain. And the reason I put it up is just to show you what the brain of the animals is like that we're talking about today. Looking at the expansiveness, looking at the levels of neocortical expansion convolutions. This is a very elaborated large brain. And it's a brain like this that I've been studying for the past 30 years. And I think you can see why. And today, what we are going to do is learn more about the owners of that brain. So today we're going to find out more about beluga behavior, communication, and culture. Let me introduce my three guests. The first is Greg O'Cory-Crow, who is professor at Florida Atlantic University, Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute. And Greg is a National Geographic explorer, known for his research on social learning, which I have to say was groundbreaking. He's also studied culture and resilience in beluga whales. He studied kinship patterns and migratory culture in several beluga communities in the Arctic. And his work also extends to stellar sea lions, ice eels, bottlenose dolphins, and polar bears. And get this, as if Greg's talents weren't enough, he plays in a cover band called Alternative Therapy. So I want to welcome Greg O'Cory-Crow.
Thank you. How did you find out about that?
Oh, I have my ways. I have my ways.
Okay, I need to be careful. Thank you so much. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Next, Valeria Vergara, who is a senior research scientist for the Raincoast Conservation Foundation. It's a new position that she just obtained. Valeria is also an advisor for the Whale Sanctuary Project, and we're so proud to have her as that. She's conducted really seminal studies of beluga whale communication, both in captivity and in the wild. And she's well known for her discovery of contact calls between beluga mothers and their calves. She's also doing some very important work on anthropogenic noise and how it affects beluga communication. And I love the name of your new project. Mom, can you hear me? Beautiful. So thank you, Valeria. And finally, but not least, Jacqueline Aubin, who is a doctoral student at the University of Windsor in the biological sciences. And she's been studying acoustic communication in beluga whales with Valeria. She's hopes to use the patterns of beluga contact call production she comes to understand and study in the St. Lawrence belugas to protect them, since the St. Lawrence belugas are indeed an endangered beluga population. I want to welcome all of my guests. And what we're going to do today, just a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to start off with Greg, and we are going to give them an opportunity to tell you about their research. We're then going to discuss a pivotal question that I have for them that I'll reveal later. And then for the last 15 minutes or so, we're going to take Q&A questions from you, the audience. So without further ado, let's begin with Greg O'Corey-Crow.
Okay, so today I'm just going to talk to you a bit about some of our work on beluga whales. My work has a lot to do with the social structure of beluga whales. I'm going to pose 4 questions for our audience here. Just to get the ball rolling, these are some of the questions I'm most interested in. Do beluga whales have culture? What do we know about the social lives of beluga whales? Is it always best to stay with family? That's a question we can all ask ourselves, I'm sure. And then the last 2 questions are sort of general questions that I'm particularly interested in, more speculative. Do all social species form societies? It's kind of a term we use a lot, and it's maybe something we should take a second look at. And also, belugas are very long-lived. You know, do they play the long game? Life, if well-lived, is it long enough? So, as a little background, there obviously is growing concern over the impacts of climate change and in Arctic ecosystems, not only on species like beluga whales, but on the indigenous communities that rely upon them. And a lot of our work in our group is looking at this general concept of resilience and applying resilience to some of our research. Resilience, which is the long-term capacity of a system to deal with change and continue to develop. But one aspect people haven't really looked at is behavioral capabilities. And I think, you know, that slide of the brain that Laurie just showed, you know, gives you some indication of maybe the capabilities of this incredible species to exhibit resilience in a time of trial and a time of change. So that's sort of the background. And what we're going to talk today about is really the capacity of this amazing species to acquire new knowledge and alter their behavior quickly enough. And we think that's the key to their survival in a changing Arctic. So the issue here is the ability to change and the speed at which they can change. And the way we're tackling that is in the context of resilience. So we're going to look at a little about our social structure studies, our studies on social learning, and obviously on culture. So the first question, do whales have culture? Well, to me, it comes down to something like this. What do we mean by culture? And recently, people like Hal Whitehead and Luke Rendell coined the term culture when looking at animal societies as information or behavior shared within a community, which is acquired by conspecifics through some sort of social learning. So I was particularly interested in migratory cultures. We seem to have the elements in this species for the evolution of some kind of culture. They're highly social. They undergo these seasonal migrations. We think there's probably akin elements to that social structure, and maybe they are highly philopatric to where they've been born. And so a number of studies have occurred on other species looking at migratory culture, notably African elephants. And so we started to look at this in a number of ways, working with our indigenous partners, looking and listening to their knowledge, using some modern techniques like satellite telemetry. This is a paper that just came out by Luke Story and colleagues, working with Lisa Lassetto. This is Lisa here and her team when we tagged some whales recently up in the Beaufort Sea, and you know, sketched out these incredible epic journeys that these whales took. And we found that, you know, basically over the course of years, belugas follow these same routes, some very, very extensive routes. We added genetics to that story, and that is a long story. I can tell it another time. But we were able to show that not only were the same groups of whales coming back to the same areas, but we were identifying animals that were related across the decades. And so we proposed this idea that actually belugas do have culture, and social learning is a key piece of that, and it probably occurs among closely related individuals. So that was where we sort of jump into the next question: is that indeed the case? Do belugas have these highly kin-based social um, uh, societies? And usually, I'll just dwell on this, social structure is coined is viewed in terms of probably involving closely related individuals based on this idea of kin selection. As John Maynard Smith once said, he was prepared to lay down his life for 8 of his cousins or 2 of his brothers. So in other words, you're prepared to expel a lot of risk helping others if they're very closely related to you. And this ties into ideas of cooperation and leadership in our own societies. Well, once again, the belugas really blew us away with some of their, some of the revelations, and we found that yes, indeed, some of them are highly related, but in fact, belugas spend an awful lot of time with unrelated individuals as well. And so this is sort of a genetic kind of network of 45 whales from one particular group that we studied. We also found that in some cases, particularly with adult bulls, that very few of them are in fact related. So that's kind of similar to some other species. And then we also found that in fact, they weren't purely matrilineal, even though we think there are obviously strong maternal relationships among some individuals. We're learning now that belugas, once again, are a little more complicated, which of course makes them a lot more interesting. And so that gets us into kind of the speculative thing that we are moving forward, and this discussion could be a great forum for that. What's really interesting about belugas is sometimes they look like these large aggregations that you see with caribou or schools of fish or flocks of birds, but then other times they look like very small coordinated groups of animals, like communities of chimpanzees, pods of killer whales, packs of wolves. So they seem to span the gamut. They seem to sort of straddle these 2 different worlds. And then just sort of finally, this issue that I'm getting more and more interested in is, they're such long-lived animals, and you could say as an evolutionary biologist that's an adaptive trait, but it's also just a curious, I think, thing to know that there's other animals out there that have an incredible amount of similarities to us. They live as long as us. They form these complicated societies. And so if you live a long time, well, you learn a lot about a lot of things. And that gets back to Laurie's original slide. And we're starting to look at things like epigenetics to get into that. So I'll just leave it there, talk about some of our future work. We're starting a project again with DFO and Courtney Watt in Winnipeg to go back north. And I just reiterate what Laurie said about our friends in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I hope we get a lot of questions about that. I have a lot of questions, and it's just, this whole issue of what is a society. It's not just a bunch of individuals. There's some structure there, there's something there. And what is that? So that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you again. For folks listening in, please post your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to as many as we possibly can. So let's keep the story going and ask Valeria Vergara to share her work with us.
Okay. Let's see. So you guys should be seeing the first slide. Is that right?
Yes.
Right. So I'm gonna try to keep it as succinct as yours, Greg. I don't know if I'll be successful, but I'll try. So excited to be here with you all. So what you're going to hear next, just make sure you have your volume on high, is a deafening cacophony of sounds from a species that is called the sea canary for a reason. So that was just a little taster. Belugas make all sorts of sound. They have an incredibly complex communication system. And I've spent the last couple of decades trying to understand this communication system. And one of the aspects that I studied is their group cohesion calls. So during my early research days, I found that belugas produce contact calls that are used, like Lori said at the beginning, for mother-calf contact, but also to maintain group cohesion. And for those of you that don't have an acoustic background, this is a spectrogram that the screen is showing that allows us to see what we sometimes cannot hear. And spectrograms are basically two-dimensional visual representations of a sound, and they have a frequency on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. I'm going to play this for you. This is a couple of contact calls that you're going to hear. The first one is a complex call that has an overlapping whistle component. That's the red line here that you won't be able to hear, but it's there. And the second is a simple contact call. So hopefully you heard that okay. And so two studies that I conducted with colleagues about a decade apart showed us that that belugas go through a babbling stage, very much like the human babbling stage or the birds of song. And they first make underdeveloped calls that are much less stereotyped than adult calls, and they very slowly develop the adult calls that and adopt the adult repertoire. Beluga contact calls have been identified by a number of people in several populations around the world for the last couple of decades. And this is not surprising because contact calls have been described in most species of bird and mammals whose vocalizations have been studied. And the amount and type of identity information provided by contact calls is really related to the kinds of social organization that we find. So identity signals may be shared at the level of the group, or they may be individually distinctive. And so socially stable species, and key examples are killer whales or sperm whales. Both species live in tightly bonded matrilineal social units for their whole life. And they often converge on shared group-specific contact calls because signaling group membership is very important. And then you have fission-fusion societies, which are a lot more fluid and individually distinctive vocalizations called vocal signatures are a lot more typical in these societies. They basically need to be individually distinctive to mediate their social interactions and be able to identify each other amongst the constant comings and goings of such a fluid society. And belugas really fit this group of species, and Greg told you a little bit about that. They are the social butterflies of the whale world, and I love showing this slide because my daughter made it for me. So I include it in every talk. The groups periodically join and split other groups, and they form long-term friendships, not only with relatives, but with non-related belugas, as Greg very well knows. Females take care of each other's young, and Jacqueline, I'm sure, will tell you a little bit about this. Juveniles form kindergarten groups, and they form, of course, communities and networks, as demonstrated by Greg's work. So true vocal signatures have not been documented in any non-human mammal other than cetaceans today, but mostly a species of fission-fusion dolphin societies. Narwhals, there's a little bit of preliminary evidence, and they are coincidentally related to belugas to some extent. And so through my work, I've been investigating the idea that the social and ecological characteristics of belugas would have favored the evolution of vocal signatures. And just to clarify that a true vocal signature is very different than just differences in voice characteristics. They are signals that evolved through natural selection to enhance individual distinctiveness even more than a voice could. So to reliably broadcast identity in the very high background noise environment of the ocean, you need vocal cues that are less subtle than voice cues. So I looked into this question of whether beluga contact calls are individually distinct. in Cunningham Inlet, which is an important summering and nursery area for a portion of the Eastern High Arctic Baffin Bay population. And I spent 2 summers recording the herd from a research tower that we built at low tide. You can see it there, perhaps in the center of the circle. And I also recorded a series of temporary whale entrapments where whales would get entrapped, would split from the larger aggregation and get entrapped in shallow canals. And so these entrapments provided a perfect opportunity to record contact calls from known groups, because the belugas that got entrapped there produced contact calls almost exclusively. And I was able to drone them. And this offered a very good idea of the group composition and numbers. So pairing recordings and drone images is a lot of what I do, a lot of how I do my work. And we can chat about this a little more later. And so my co-author Mariana and I separated contact calls into simple and complex, and we classified over 10,000 contact calls from these entrapments by their potential signature elements, this overlapping component that the complex contact calls have. And we created a catalog of all the complex contact call types in each of the entrapments. So this is just an example of entrapment 11. It has 13 types. There's 5 examples of each type, and you can see that there's a lot less variability within types than across types. Hopefully this illustrates that. And so we designed a classification task to test the trustworthiness of our data and determine if naive judges could come up with the same contact call types than we did. This is a well-known technique in bioacoustics. And fortunately, there was a very high inter-observer classification agreement. And also the judges agreed with our classification over 90% of the time. So very, very good results. And we also quantified these results, but I'm not going to bore you with stats. And what's really cool is that the more individuals we had in an entrapment, the more contact call types we had, down to the fact that the only entrapment with one individual had a single contact call type. So our results suggest that wild belugas may have a system of signature calls, indeed, but whether signature identity is encoded just individually or whether some signatures may be shared, perhaps with friends or with closely related animals, we don't know. This study couldn't confirm whether the analyzed sounds are just true individual signatures, because but the data points in that direction. But we didn't know who was saying what in this location. We're able to do that in the St. Lawrence estuary, where I also conduct some of my studies. It's an endangered population. It's isolated, declining, and there's been a very long-term photo identification study of this population, and it provides a really great opportunity to pair recordings from D tags. Those are non-intrusive tags that attach to the whales via suction cups, with a known with photo identification of those whales, basically. And so all I'm going to say about this is that we've been able to identify 4 different contact calls in 4 D tags, and that the analysis is very tedious and very time consuming, but great, and we're still at it. So more next year. And now, how whales and dolphins use sound is a really important aspect of their ecology that allows us to understand how underwater noise impacts whales. Water transmits sound a lot more efficiently than air. And so the levels of underwater human-generated noise really have increased at a staggering rate over the last 60 years. And chronic exposure to this noise not only causes stress for the animals, but it can mask their communication and their echolocation signals. And in the St. Lawrence, there's been an unexplained calf mortality since 2008. There's also increased female deaths associated with postpartum complications since 2010. And the threats to the recovery of this population include noise and disturbance. And so my team and I have been focusing on how mother-calf contact is compromised by noise. And you can see Jacqueline here that worked with us on this as well. We worked from a small research tower in Bay Saint Marguerite, an area that is used for socializing, for resting, for caring for the young. And we documented the number and types of boats. We documented herd type and herd composition. We also estimated the loudness of the calls in various beluga age classes and did extensive modeling that I'm not going to show you today, but I will show you this. Hopefully you can hear that. So those were contact calls that you heard, and the synchronizing of recordings again and drone images allows us to infer so much more about beluga behavior and communication and group composition. And so we found that neonates produce much quieter calls, that adults have communication ranges for their calls that are 18 times larger than for newborns, that there was a 53% reduction in range in the vocalizations of newborn calls when they are produced in noise. And this, of course, has implications for the ability of moms and newborns to reunite if they happen to become separated. If the mom and calf become unintentionally separated because of some kind of disturbance that may cause a startle response, for example, then noise may interfere with these reunions. And masking by noise, of course, can act synergistically with various other factors in this population. So the work on contact calls is leading to very promising questions. These are photos all from last season with Jacqueline and Mariana in the St. Lawrence. 2021 was the first year of a study of beluga dialects, and that's a really exciting research project that Jacqueline is leading, and I really can't wait to see what she discovers. So over to her. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valeria.
Stop
Well,
sharing.
with that, let's go right to Jacqueline and indeed hear what she's discovered.
Sounds good. All right. So today I'm going to be talking about sort of a continuation of Valeria's work, looking at the possibility of communities and dialects in St. Lawrence belugas. And before I get into any of my findings or hypotheses, I just want to acknowledge that the data I'm talking about today were collected on the traditional territories of the Wolastoqiyik, Wasipikuk, Wendake, Nyanwencio, and Wabanaki First Nations. And of course, I'd like to thank all of my collaborators, Valeria and Mariana at Rain Coast, the entire Mental Lab, everybody at the GRAM, and everybody else who's made my project possible. Thank you very much. So what is it like to be a St. Lawrence beluga? So we know that it's an isolated population. They're the southernmost belugas in the entire world. They're not connected to any other populations. And they have pretty limited migrations compared to the belugas that Greg was talking about. So there'll be some movement towards the Gulf of the St. Lawrence in the winter, and then movement around the calving season in late June and July, down further upstream in the St. Lawrence. But it's really not a major migration. And we tend to see groups of adult males and groups of females being quite separate. They don't do a lot of mixing most of the time. And so I'm actually mostly interested in what's going on with the females. So in my master's, I found that belugas perform allocare, which is really just a fancy way of saying that they look after each other's offspring. So we were using drone footage to look at these behaviors, and we saw that very tiny newborn calves, as well as great big older juveniles, were spending a lot of time swimming with their moms, of course, but they were also spending a lot of time swimming with other females that were in groups with their mothers. So that was a really interesting finding. And here's one of my favorite drone clips from this entire study. We have two females here with one newborn calf, and you can tell that he's pretty fresh still because he's not swimming too well yet. He's kind of clumsy. And I find it just so heartwarming seeing these two animals turning towards the calf as he swims away, and then they kind of, you can see here, scoop him up and swim away with him. And now, of course, I have no idea who these individuals are. I could theorize it's perhaps a mother and a grandmother, maybe a mother and an aunt, or possibly two individuals who aren't related to each other at all and who just share a common bond in looking after this calf. And so seeing these images was really one of my first experiences of seeing the strong bonds that seem to be present within these groups. And so we also know that belugas go through menopause just like humans do. And it's very rare in the animal kingdom. There's only a few species of whales where we see females that are spending a large portion of their lives not able to reproduce. And that really drives home how important these older females probably are for taking care of their offspring and their grandchildren, and possibly as holders of cultural knowledge. And we also know that there's preliminary evidence of summer communities in the St. Lawrence beluga population, particularly for these females. So this is based on almost 20 years of photo identification data, recently published just this year, fresh off the press. And it seems to show that we have 3 possible communities. So the Saguenay community here in red, and then the South Shore in orange, and finally an upstream community in teal here. And so it seems like every summer, females are coming back to these same areas, the same animals coming back to the same areas. And so you might be wondering, with 20 years of photo ID, why are we still talking about preliminary evidence? Why aren't we more certain? And well, so here are 6 photos of some belugas that we tried to photo ID just this past summer in the field. So belugas, unfortunately, are very hard to photo identify. And of course, photo ID is a great tool for studying whales and including belugas when they have really apparent marks, like some of the whales that appeared in Valeria's slideshow. But what we're finding is that, especially for these younger adults, they're perfectly smooth white, and it's very hard to identify them. In the field this summer, we had quite a little episode where we had one female and a calf that we were seeing every day, and we called this female. She was very perfectly smooth, like not a mark on her. And so she was hard to identify, but we thought that the calf was pretty distinguishable because it had a dark band on its neck. And so we called the mother Smoothie because she was so smooth and beautiful. And the calf we called Batty because it was a bit of a very active calf, you could say. It seemed like it was going batty sometimes. And so I still remember one day when we heard, I think we heard Valeria on the radio, and she says, I think we have a problem because there's 2 Smoothies and 2 Baddies here. So we figured out that, well, the animal that we had thought we were watching was probably a few different ones. All that to say, it's really hard to distinguish these animals visually. So you probably see where I'm going with this based on Valeria's work. But since we can't really identify most of them visually, it becomes really interesting to see if we can identify them acoustically using those contact calls that Valeria was talking about. So I won't go too much in depth about this, but just remember that we have simple contact calls like this one here, or we can have complex ones that have this potential signature element that's probably unique to either one individual or a small group of animals, like this one here, or this one, which I really like. So all of these contact calls are contact calls that Valeria recorded in the Arctic. We'll be getting to a couple St. Lawrence calls in a minute. And so our idea to figure out what's going on with this population is to record the contact calls at 3 sites and to see if we're seeing unique repertoires of contact calls at each site, to see if different animals are using perhaps all 3 sites, or as we think, if they're really returning to the same areas and only being recorded at one area. Which leads me to a follow-up question. So if we do have these distinct communities, is it possible that they might have dialects? So looking back at these 3 areas, is it possible that the contact calls that we record at each site, could we pick out some, maybe like an accent where by listening you can tell, oh, that sounds like a Saguenay contact call, or that sounds like a South Shore contact call. Mm-hmm. And so we know that dialects have been identified in whales, particularly killer whales and sperm whales. And dialects arise from vocal learning, where animals are learning their vocalizations from animals that are close to them or animals that are close to them socially. So often the 2 are the same for whales. And so there's also some evidence of dialects in short-fin pilot whales. So with all of this mounting evidence about cetacean dialects, is it possible that we might also see dialects in belugas? That's what I'm hoping to answer in the next few years. And so there's one thing in particular that might be impacting dialects at these 3 sites, and that is boat noise. So this gray tracing on the map is showing routes of cargo ships in the St. Lawrence. And you can see that most of them are passing close to the North Shore here. And we also have a pretty good, well-used route going up the Saguenay Fjord. So this is a fairly busy area. And so based on this, this map and the overlap between the routes and our potential communities, we're expecting that animals using different sites are probably exposed to different levels of noise. And let me show you an example of this. So this is a cargo ship that passed very close to our study site last summer. And here I'll play, first of all, 1 hour before the cargo ship passed. So maybe put your sound up a bit. It's a little quiet. Actually, you can't hear it at all for me. So this is very quiet. And this is when the cargo ship is passing through. Let me play those again. Very quiet. And then right when the cargo ship is passing, it gets a lot louder. And that's just a 3-second clip. Imagine if you're a beluga and you're just listening to the cargo ships passing by every day. So we're expecting to see potentially some differences in the contact calls of animals using different sites. And there's some features that we can look at that might be adaptations to noisy environments. Like, because the boat noise is very low frequency, we might expect to hear higher frequency, especially in the signature element of the contact calls, being higher frequencies in very noisy areas. We might also see sounds, signatures that are more tonal, so more like a whistle. And then if you make a tonal sound and you add modulations to it, it makes it even better to transmit in noise. So instead of having a flat whistle, like, instead you could do something like, and that will increase the transmission of your noise or of your call and make it more likely that another animal will hear you. And so that's what we're going to be looking at to compare these calls. So it's too early to share any definitive results yet, but I really wanted you to hear some of the voices of the whales that we're studying. So here are 5 contact calls that I heard from each of the 3 sites. So there's a few from each. This one here. And finally, this one is my favorite one that I've heard yet of everything. And see if you can guess which barnyard animal this sounds like. I don't know about you, but to me that sounds exactly like a donkey. So every time it comes up in my recordings, I have a chuckle.
Can you play it again so that we can hear?
Sure. Yeah, turn your volume up and see if you can hear it well. I really love that one. So of course, it's too early to say whether these patterns of contact calls are really showing dialects or communities. But I will say, so far, every contact call that I've heard, I've only heard in one site. So preliminary results do seem to support the hypothesis that there's communities, but stay tuned for more news. So I'll just leave you on this final clip of a group of females with a calf. And I really want you to remember that by continuing to study these animals in the wild and even in semi-natural settings like the whale sanctuary, eventually we'll become ever closer to really understanding who these whales are. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Thank you. I hope everyone heard those wonderful whistles. They're hard to hear, and if you're really quiet, you can hear them, but they're incredibly interesting and diverse. So thank you so much. Well, I want to thank all of you for your presentations. And before we go to our Q&A, I'd like to pose a key question to you that Jacqueline just brought up about the application of your work in a sanctuary. So as you know, the Whale Sanctuary Project is creating a 100-acre seaside sanctuary in Port Hilford Bay in Nova Scotia, where we hope to give a life to 6, 8, maybe 10 beluga whales, and perhaps in a separate area, 2 or 3 orcas. As you know, this is a natural environment where the animals will be able to spend time exploring the natural environment, and they will again have a lot of space to do that. And one of the things we will need to be doing is taking data on how they're doing, observational data, non-invasive data, non-intrusive data. But it gives us an opportunity to learn about not only how these whales are accommodating to this new environment, but also how can we use the kinds of data we collect in the sanctuary to elevate or help assist studies of beluga whales in the wild, and as well as perhaps in other forms of captivity. So that's the big question. And I'd like to just spend a little bit of time hearing your answers. So maybe we'll start with Greg.
Sure, and it's an excellent question, and 2 wonderful presentations there. Thank you very much, Jacqueline and Valeria. Yeah, I've been thinking about this, and I think, you know, what I'm interested in is how any species right now is able to adapt and adapt quickly enough. And we can look at things at a molecular level, we can look at epigenetics, we can look at things at a physiological level, but behavioral is almost the front line, you know. How do we ourselves adjust to a changing world? And I think what's really interesting about, you know, the sort of environment you're talking about is they're going to obviously have to learn on the fly straight away. So how quickly they do that is I think very relevant. I think also as a molecular biologist, you know, when you study animals in the wild or in any particular setting, and you look at interactions between animals, you know, the idea of being able to, you know, measure the environment. We're doing a lot of work, for example, on metabarcoding and microbiome research. So, you know, that obviously plays into my thinking when you look at animals in a setting like this. And the 2 big issues for me is, I think a lot of management agencies, a lot of conservation groups, and the society in general, they always want to know, well, how is all this wonderful research going to help the species or the ecosystem? And we do a really bad job of ourselves articulating how our research actually can have a measurable impact. And one of the areas I think there needs to be more work on is risk assessment and decision analysis. So you found out this wonderful thing, you know, to a lot of people who have to make decisions, they're like, that's great, but how does that help me? And so there may be unique opportunities to try and understand risk, and also cost benefit, so that decision makers, you can almost lay it out for them. Here's the decision you need to make. You make this decision, not so good. You make this decision, much better. So maybe there's a chance there. And the last thing I would say is, on a lot of conservation issues, we never bring the public to the table. We kind of keep them on the outer fringe, you know, sort of like the UN Security Council, you know. We kind of need to bring them to the table with their ideas and their solutions, because very often the scientists can give you the data and the interpretation, but the solutions come from a collective. Everybody is a problem solver. Belugas are problem solvers. So, you know, I think maybe what you've envisioned is a way to bring everybody closer into the story.
That's great. I mean, I think that's absolutely right, is to help everyone understand who these animals are. Um, and the thing you said about resilience, I think is so critically important, because that is going to be important for the individuals who come to the sanctuary. What can we learn about how to increase their resilience, or what factors are involved in resilience that can be applied to a free-ranging individual that can help in conservation? And that's something that's it's going to be extremely important. So I really think we have a lot to talk about, Greg. So yes, thank you so much. Valeria?
Sure. Great answers, Greg. Thanks for that. And I'm going to turn this a little bit into, to provide an acoustic angle, and say again that to understand a species that is so incredibly acoustic, you have to understand their sounds. There is no understanding these species without incorporating their sounds into the equation. And you do this by listening and watching. And listening and watching is becoming a little easier in the wild, but there's a lot of complications. And it is much easier to do in a sanctuary context, where you have information on the sex of the animals, on the age of the animals. You know where the animals are at all times. You can record and follow and observe very closely. The ability we have in a sanctuary to pair sounds with visuals, and we do this in the wild as well, can provide really key information that we can apply to studies that use passive acoustic monitoring. This is a fundamental tool used in many mitigation and management strategies for a lot of not just for belugas, but for a lot of at-risk populations. And without really understanding what each sounds represent, all of the inferences that we can make when we analyze the recordings are a little less meaningful. So that, studying them in a sanctuary context can help with this. And conversely, what we learn in the wild can help us with things like evaluating the well-being of the residents of the sanctuary, once we understand a little bit more what calling rates tell us, or calling types tell us about their stress levels, for instance, or their aggression.
Yes.
And then, of course, things like longitudinal photos of known sanctuary residents throughout a year or two, or throughout a pregnancy, which that probably won't happen.
We won't be breeding in the sanctuary, but I know but we still going to be looking at their weight and how that changes.
Exactly. And so you know their weight, you know their health, you know what they've been eating and how much, and you take these longitudinal photos throughout the year that can inform photogrammetric health studies in the wild. People are using drones to fly over belugas to try and understand whether they're more or less healthy than in previous years. And so sanctuary residents would really help with this kind of thing.
Absolutely. I mean, all of these ideas are ideas that we have to be thinking about now while we're designing the sanctuary, so that we can bake it into the design, make sure that whatever we design and build and create allows us to ask these and answer these questions. So very exciting. Jacqueline? And then we're going to get to Q&A.
I'll definitely echo a lot of what Valeria said previously about how you can use the acoustic data that you collect from the sanctuary to inform broader studies in the wild. And in particular, acoustics is so interesting for studying wild populations, because you can do it in such a non-intrusive way. You put a hydrophone in the water and you let it run, and you can get so much data out of that, just completely hands-off, no disturbance introduced at all. And if you can learn things from the sanctuary, and again, just by having a hydrophone in the water that's not disturbing the animals at all, it's amazing what we could probably learn that we can apply to future studies with passive acoustic monitoring on wild populations. So that's definitely a really interesting avenue. And for me personally, somewhat selfishly, I'd say I'd have a huge interest in seeing over time, recording the contact calls of these animals, the context in which we hear the contact calls the most, monitoring possibly any changes in their contact calls. So, if you have animals that are introduced together, would we possibly see their contact calls becoming more similar, maybe more different from each other? That would all be like really amazing questions that we can ask in a sanctuary context that is just so impossibly difficult to do in the wild. And you can do it in captivity, but there's always a question of, well, does it really apply to real life, to the wild? So there's so many interesting opportunities and questions that we can ask.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, I get so excited talking about these things because there are so many fascinating things we can do in this unique niche that we're creating with the Seaside Sanctuary. There's a question here by Lolly who asks, what is the grandmother effect? She sees this popping up in a few slides. What is that? What's the grandmother effect?
So it's a very good question, and it's a hot topic right now. I think any one of us could answer this question. But basically, there are surprisingly few species, and that we're aware of at least, other than ourselves, where there is what they call a post-reproductive lifespan. There is menopause. And of course, being evolutionary biologists, everybody will try and say, well, why is that a thing? And the argument is that for species where females stop reproducing but still have a very long lifespan, the trade-off is, rather than competing with my daughters or other female relatives in terms of reproduction, why don't I do myself a huge favor and stop reproducing and actually help raise my grandchildren? And that seems very natural to us, obviously. But it's very rarely seen in the wild. It's been documented pretty spectacularly in killer whales, where they actually have very strong evidence that older mothers not only are seen a lot with calves, but may be repositories for a lot of crucial information on food resources. And they've shown that calves that get to hang out with grandma actually have a higher survival. Where it gets exciting for belugas, once again, is they are predicted to behave in a certain way because they have a post-reproductive lifespan. So do narwhals, so do pilot whales. And one of those might be that, well, they spend a lot of time with their relatives and they're helping their grandchildren. Well, we still have to figure out if that is actually what they do. So again, they're the one that kind of throws the spanner in the works of some of these things. I suspect they probably do, but I also think it's going to be very hard for us to tease that apart. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, what something looks like is not always what it is, and so you have to collect the data. I have a question here for any of you from Sarika, and she asked this really interesting. Is there evidence of beluga whales of different societies teaching each other adaptive skills?
Teaching each other what?
Adaptive skills, for instance, skills pertaining to resiliency through climate change. Is there anything like that, or that you might see or conjecture?
The only thing we know of, and I don't want to monopolize, but the only thing we know of now is that belugas are turning up in different places more frequently. And we like to think they're the wrong places, but it could be that belugas are capable of changing and adapting their behavior. I don't know if that answers the question. Maybe Valeria Jacqueline can weigh in terms of adaptive sounds, but we're starting to see sort of things start to move, and what that means, I can't say. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, to understand teaching in a wild context and really observe who is teaching who and what constitutes teaching behavior, is so difficult. I was doing a little bit of that in an easier population of a different species, and I spent some time studying the Patagonia killer whales in Argentina, and there you can see teaching behavior from one animal to another, because you see these killer whales bringing dead sea lions and stuffing them, next to to a calf that is accompanying them, and then throwing the dead sea lion onto the beach and launching to strand themselves and get it. And they do this with pieces of seaweed, with sticks, with all sorts of things that are not food or immediate food. And it's evident in that case that there is a teaching and learning phenomenon occurring. But I can't think of any beluga situation where you're actually watching in the wild teaching and play. Yeah.
I'll just add, so of course, like Valeria said, it's so difficult to really definitely observe teaching and learning, social learning in wild animals. And it's especially hard also if we're trying to look at animals or belugas in different groups, because we're only just getting a little bit better at teasing apart like who belongs to which group. But there is one example I can think of in the St. Lawrence where it's not actually, it wouldn't be an example of teaching a beluga from another group, but actually potentially teaching an individual of another species. So for several years now, there's been a male narwhal hanging out in the St. Lawrence with a group of belugas.
Yes.
And so we don't really know. I mean, he ended up there, and he's been apparently adopted by a group of belugas, and it would be so interesting to see and figure out, like, have these belugas taught this narwhal how to live in the St. Lawrence, which is obviously a very different environment than the narwhal would be used to. So it would be so interesting to look into that a bit more and figure that out. Obviously a very difficult task, but a fun one to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that gets to another question, which I think is very closely related, which has to do with, are there any relationships formed through language with closely related species like narwhals and belugas? And we have an instance there. We don't know the role of communication in a very specific way, but obviously there has to be something going on. Do you agree? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to mention quickly that I had the opportunity to listen to narwhal vocalizations for one of my jobs. It is hard to disentangle them from belugas.
Yeah.
And that paper from Ari Shapiro on narwhal contact calls, he sent me some narwhal calls to analyze for my PhD thesis years ago. And they're so similar, the calls. And it makes sense that, two species that have evolved a communication system in the same Arctic environment would share a lot of similarities in their calls.
Yeah, exactly. Here's an interesting question from Charmaine, who asks, are you able to identify the messages behind certain calls? Like, this is a call for danger, this is a call for food. How good are we at determining what the calls actually mean?
Yeah, so it's very difficult. You can begin to know general categories. So we now know, we have an inkling of what calls that are associated with aggression sound like. And this is because we've observed them a lot, both in captivity and in the wild, producing a series of jaw claps that they open and close their mandibles and produce this gunshot sound that is accompanied by chases, for example, by mock biting, by open mouth threats, and a bunch of very short and rough sounding vocalizations that are generally often associated with jaw claps. So we know aggression. We know play, because you can tell when belugas are playing or in a playful mood. And it's beautiful. They sound like chirpy canaries when they play. Their calls become a lot less rough, more tonal, We know contact calls that are used for mother-calf contact, for, cohesion. But we don't know the specifics of a call. the details are not that fine tuned. And Jack,
That's the key, right? Is to go beyond what we know to really understand how much do they communicate to each other content wise.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Information content. I would die to know.
I think a lot of us would.
Yeah.
we all would.
I think it's also important to remember that the content that might be important to a beluga might feel very different to what we're used to expressing with language. So our ideas of meaning and expressing certain things might be fairly different for a beluga. It's definitely not going to be a one-to-one match between human languages and how belugas communicate, even though they're both vocal systems.
That's a brilliant observation. I mean, it's something we ought to remind ourselves about because we are humans and that's how we process information. Greg, do you want to add to that?
No, but I think that idea of we have to remind ourselves that it's our window on the world that we're looking through. And I have to catch myself every time I get into something. So for example, looking at social learning, social behavior, you find yourself sort of busy with your head down, putting things together that suit the way you look at the world. And then you take your head up from the page and you go, I mean, if a beluga was here, would he be looking at me going, no, that's actually not what we're doing at all? And so, you know, it's kind of, in one way, it is a little disconcerting, but in another way, it is really quite exhilarating to go, you know, we do have to remember that they may have an entirely different sort of solution to a lot of the same issues. And in a way, I find that kind of exciting. So
it's extremely exciting. I think it's what we're all trying to get at with this research. I have one more question, and I apologize for not being able to get to all of them, but the last question goes to Rachel, who is 9 years old.
Oh.
Or actually your daughter's, Rachel, a friend, I know you, and you've been a great supporter of the Whale Sanctuary Project, and your daughter is 9 years old. And you had an intriguing question I've never heard before. And that is, do the dads ever talk to the babies? We're so, you know, it's all about mom and calf, right? But is there anything that we know about that?
okay,
I can.
okay.
Oh, go ahead, Greg.
Actually, I'll let certainly the acousticians weigh in first, but I do have a few theories I'll add to it. So fire away.
Yeah, so I can't say too much about the acoustics aspect of it because these observations were only with the drone and never with hydrophones in the water. So I can't say about talking to the babies. But I will say I was quite shocked sometimes looking at drone footage and looking for allocare behaviors. And I was shocked sometimes that I would be looking at an individual, like a very large individual, and I'd say, that really looks like a male, but he's swimming with a tiny little calf. And that was completely outside of what I was expecting to see because, you know, we talk about different aspects of cetacean sociality, and sometimes the relationships between the males and the offspring is not a pleasant thing sometimes. So I really wasn't expecting to see caregiving behaviors by a large male being given to little tiny calves. And I really had to watch those videos a couple times to really like check out all of the little things that I see to distinguish between a female and a male. And there's some cases where I'm pretty sure that there's definitely males giving care. Now, if it's the dad or not, like that's impossible for me to say. But sometimes the males do seem to be doing caregiving behaviors to offspring. Yeah.
It's fascinating.
I don't think that I have anything to add to that. That's a great observation.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we probably may have underestimated the role of males
Yeah.
in beluga societies. And we certainly know that they sometimes separate, and we have this males often traveling alone. We often recognize them because they're in all male groups, and when they're in all male groups, they kind of do what all male groups do when they're together. Let's just leave it at that. But there's an awful lot of times when you see mixed age groups, mixed sex groups all together, males interacting with all age groups, particularly young. And one really intriguing thing we found in some of the genetic analysis was, even when we sampled all male groups, I mentioned a lot of the time they're unrelated. But then sometimes we'll see multiple generations of related males swimming together. And that to me is intriguing. You're like, is that accidental? Is that intentional? And when you're in particularly these resident populations where it's kind of unavoidable to somehow interact with sometimes very old males, you realize, some of these males may be related to a lot of other whales in this population. And they maybe also be huge resources of knowledge, of information. And whether they actively teach or not, I think a lot of other animals may actively learn from older males. And so I think there's a lot of room there for trying to understand that one. Once again, I think belugas are going to kind of upset the apple cart. And we're going to start learning some really cool things there. So Rachel, when you or your daughter grows up, that's what you need to be studying.
Yep. And we have 3 role models here. We need more and more people to be studying these animals for their own value, and also to save them and to protect them and help them lead better lives. Well, wow. I could go on and on, but this has been fantastic. I want to thank Jacqueline. I want to thank Valeria and Greg. I want to talk to you all more about the sanctuary and some of the incredibly cool things that we could learn about belugas when we get them. And I want to thank everyone for joining us and for all your questions and interest. So from the Whale Sanctuary Project, thank you very much. And everyone, be well and be safe.
Thank you,
so
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for tuning in. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care. Great chatting with everybody.
Yeah.